Hello, this is Paola Harris, and I am here with Sid Goldberg and with Ross Coulthart, whose new book is causing a stir. Several new books have come out this year. And the reason why I'm supporting this particular one is because he is an investigative journalist. He is not a ufologist. So he came into this with a historical perspective. In fact, the book is chronologically historical. And also because he is from Australia, and you might tell us a little bit about your background, you've included Australian cases. Okay, welcome.
It's a real pleasure to be here, Paola. How did I get into this? And while I was living in New Zealand, I guess one of the seminal incidents that woke me up to the phenomenon was the Kaikoura UFO incident in the north of the South Island of New Zealand in Christmas of 1978, when I was a 16-year-old teenage boy. And like most Kiwis, I thought little of it at the time when the government, the Air Force, made an announcement 3 weeks after the incident that there was nothing in it. Don't worry, ladies and gentlemen, it's a non-event. It's easily explained. What the pilot of this cargo aircraft saw in his cockpit late one night wasn't a flying saucer. It was reflections of squid boat lights, fishing boat lights off clouds. End of story. And if it wasn't that, because it's possibly it wasn't, it was probably the planet Venus. And that sounded plausible to me. And I went on with my life and went to university and studied law. And in the course of that, I met an air traffic controller by the name of John Cordy. And I also met other people at the Wellington Airport, which was the airport across Cook Strait, the body of water between the North and the South Island of New Zealand. And Wellington Airport sat on the very end of the North Island of New Zealand, looking towards the South Island. And the incident that I was talking about had actually happened way up on the northernmost tip, the northeastern tip of the South Island. So they had very good radar from 30 miles away of what they saw. And the Air Force report, I remember I was at a party and I spoke to an informant who worked at Wellington Airport at the time. And I said, oh, it's a real shame your radar was broken. And he went, radar wasn't broken that night. What do you mean the radar was broken? This is one of our major airports in New Zealand. Radar doesn't break. And I said, well, that's what the Royal New Zealand Air Force report says. And certainly it suggested that the radar wasn't functioning properly. And in the end, when I started the research for my book, I tracked down John Cordy, who's now in his 80s. And John said, that's rubbish, absolute bloody rubbish. No truth in it at all. The radar wasn't busted. There was nothing wrong with it. And what I saw was objects at 14,000 feet maneuvering around the aircraft. And it was interesting because it rocked my worldview, because I have to admit, as a journalist, I giggled. I used to laugh at the phenomenon of UFOs. I thought it was a joke that people were obsessed with UFOs. And I've got friends who told me that they've seen UFOs, and rather uncharitably, I've laughed at them. And so I was very dismissive. And then I guess instinct told me to keep on looking. And I found Quentin Fogarty, who was the cameraman who'd shot that vision for a television station here in Australia. And he happened to be in New Zealand with his family. Oddly enough, his little baby boy at the time was a guy called Ben, and Ben went on to become my cameraman at 60 Minutes Australia, which is how I got on to Quentin and how I renewed this friendship. And it was very funny because Quentin said to me, he said, look, Ross, we were standing in the cockpit of that plane as these craft came towards us. And believe me, we saw very clear craft. And he was filming with a 16mm camera film. And the film's quite striking, quite astonishing in its own right, because you can see a kind of a plasma glow and some kind of a shape behind that glow. But to be honest, at the time, I was watching it on a New Zealand black and white television set and frankly, didn't think much of the imagery. But to hear from Quentin, and then one of his colleagues, who also I hadn't realized happened to be on the plane with him, was a guy called Dennis Grant. And Dennis was one of Australia's top news anchors, one of the top political reporters for Australia. He'd gone on to a highly successful career here in Australia, an eminent, well-respected political reporter who knew all the prime ministers and reported everything in Australian politics for decades, an absolute household name. And I contacted Dennis and he was delighted to speak to me. And he said, yes, Ross, I was there too. And he said, we were literally talking to the Wellington radar people. And I said, John Cordy? And he went, yeah, I think that's the name. The Wellington radar people. And they were saying, it's at 14,000 feet, it appears to be in front of your aircraft. And he was going, and I was looking at it. It was straight there in front of us, maneuvering around us. And I think that for me was the beginning of a realization that, you see, we have a saying in journalism, and Paola, you'd know this, always assume, I'll use a polite word, a screw up rather than a conspiracy. Always assume a screw up before a conspiracy, because conspiracies rarely happen. Governments are utterly hopeless at keeping most secrets. You know, politicians invariably, when there's a leak in Australia, and they do this a lot in Australia, they don't do it as much in your country, but I've done interviews with ministers of the Crown, like the people who head government departments, the politicians who lead the departments, and they'll leak me something. And then a week later, when my story runs, they'll call a federal police leaks inquiry to investigate who was the source of this outrageous leak that has disrupted his department. And so, you know, the idea that governments can conceal things and conspire, politicians can't shut their mouths. You know, they're incapable, I believe, of keeping secrets. But in this particular incident, I've been persuaded that there was a cover-up and that there were people in the New Zealand Air Force who were badgered by the Americans, God bless them, to make this go away. And as a member of the New Zealand public at the time, it was quite a realization for me early in my research to realize that these cover-ups really do happen. And then when I came to Australia, I always had that kind of niggling interest in the phenomenon. And there were a lot of reports that I'd heard about. I'd heard about Westall, 1966.
That's in the book, by the way. I want to tell people the Westall case is in the book. It's also in James Fox's movie, The Phenomena, thanks to James Rigney. And that is about landing in a children's, with a lot of children in a schoolyard, like the one in
Zimbabwe.
Zimbabwe, yeah.
And Wales, by the way. Yeah, there's all of sightings all over the world from these schools. But if I'm going chronologically, the next story that really twigged my interest was I was working as an investigative reporter for Australia's top public affairs program, a bit like your PBS Frontline. It was called Four Corners on the Australian public broadcaster. And Four Corners is an old granny of a show, a very well-respected show. And I wasn't doing a story on UFOs. God forbid, they would never have let me do a story on UFOs. But I was talking to very senior members of the Australian Air Force about another issue, which doesn't really matter for the telling of the story. And we were filming with them all day. And at the end of a long day, they invited us to the officers' mess at this airstrip and basically said, you want a beer? And we sat down and we had a beer, and there's a room full of other pilots. And it's quite cool because you're talking about jet fighter pilots, and there's F-18s out the door. And I'm thinking, this is exciting. And then finally, this very senior officer leaned forward like this over the table and he said, could I ask you something? And I said, yeah, sure. Why don't you journalists do stories about UFOs? And I laughed. I said, because they're bullshit, you know, UFOs, they're just rubbish. And he went, no, they're not. And I wish I could tell you who this person was, because they were, in fact, quite a well-known public figure in Australia, you know, a very, very eminent military official. And anyway, the long and the short of it was, in the course of that evening, they were just summonsing over pilots saying, oh, Charlie, come over here. Bert, come over here. And all these pilots were telling me about stories they'd had. One of the most shocking to me was a P-3 Orion pilot, which is a surveillance aircraft that goes out deep. And in those days, it went out deep into the Indian Ocean, looking for Soviet ships and taking photographs of them. And the pilot, with his commanding officer's assent, told me how he had these craft come up beside him in the flight. And they'd taken photographs of them and given them to the Air Force. And so then that led me naturally to the Australian archives. And I barely had any knowledge of what was in the Australian archives on the phenomenon. But I was astonished because, just like happened in the Nevada test range when you guys were letting off nuclear bombs, Australia was the site for where the British tested their nuclear weapons in the 1950s at a place called Maralinga. And they also tested their ICBM missiles at a place in the same area called Woomera. And these were vast open tracts of outback desert, empty, or so they thought, mainly, sadly, full of transitory Aboriginal people who were essentially nomadic and living off the land. And a lot of them suffered terribly as a result of these explosions. But the upshot was that when I went through the archives, there was just the most incredible data in there recorded by our Air Force, very official sightings reports that recorded, just like at your Los Alamos and your Nevada test range, incredible, fast moving objects doing impossible things, hair turns, 90-degree turns at tens of thousands of miles an hour, tracked on radar, seen by eminent military officials and recorded in reports that were filed away. And I remember sitting in an office once and showing them to a colleague and saying, get a load of these. And it was at that point I realized just how big the stigma is with the phenomenon, because I guess one of the things about me is I've never been discouraged from investigating stories just because they're controversial. I did a story once about a doctor who was doing horrible things to women. He was actually, while they were under anesthetic, he was actually circumcising them and removing their sexual pleasure, removing their clitoris. And it was an act of sadistic crime by this doctor. And it was interesting because when I started investigating it, it was obvious that other journalists had been aware of it, but it was just such a controversial subject. Nobody wanted to go near it because it was women's business and it was embarrassing. And so we did this story, and it just exploded. It just went nuts because people were really interested, as, by the way, has my stories on the phenomenon that I've done on Australian television. They've had an unprecedented audience. And I guess to answer your question, and I'm sorry, Paola, I answered in a very long and elaborate way, my interest has been twigged by the simple fact that when I applied the skill set that I apply to any story as an investigative journalist, I freely admit I was nervous because this is such a stigmatized, taboo subject. I was thinking, oh my God, I'm going to do a story about UFOs. I'm going to write a book about UFOs. But the more I looked, when you allow for the fact that, yes, there are some people who are mentally unwell who claim to have had UFO sightings, that doesn't discount all of those sightings. And even when I went down to the absolute best sightings reports, there was a strong kernel of truth that made me think, wow, there really is something to this. And then when I started engaging with people, both in my government, privately, literally knocking on the doors of old boffins who'd worked for our equivalent of your DARPA, nothing like your DARPA, but scientists who'd worked in our defense establishment, all of them were very wide open to the probability that there is a phenomenon that is real. And a number of them directed me to the work of a fascinating guy called Harry Turner, who was in the 1970s one of Australia's most eminent scientists working for the Defence Department. And I was amused because I later on found Harry's name on sightings reports from Maralinga, where he'd been there and investigated sightings on the nuclear test range when they were letting off bombs. And when they let off bombs, all of a sudden these objects would appear over the nuclear test site. And Harry was the young physicist that they brought in from Melbourne University to investigate these sightings. And when I went through the archives and extracted different reports from the government archives, from our Air Force in particular, Harry had written an analysis of the phenomenon in the early 1970s that is deadly to any notion that this is taboo or stigma. Here was a clear-sighted, clear-minded scientist, not a nutter, somebody who was very driven by science, looking at the evidence and basing his conclusions not only on the evidence that he'd seen, but on conversations he'd had with people in his role in America. He was very, very well connected because of his role in the nuclear weapons testing with people at the Nevada test range. And Harry flat out asserted that there was a cover-up inside the American government about what they knew about the phenomenon.